There are shadows in history, places where the light of reason fails, and the darkness of human fear takes hold. Imagine a courtroom, not of stone and solemn law, but of dust and dread. The air is thick, not with incense, but with the metallic tang of uncertainty. And standing before the accused is not a learned man of jurisprudence, but a figure of terrifying, quiet authority. Judge Alaric. His eyes are not cold, but unnervingly empty, having seen too much. And on the table, beside the parchment and the cruel quill, is the instrument of his justice. Not a sword, not a scale, but a spinning wheel, a tool of hearth and home, transformed into an engine of God's will. They called it the Rota Veritatis, the wheel of truth. And when it began its silent, shuddering rotation, the fate of a man, of his very soul, was no longer in his hands, but in the whirlwind of chance. And every village knew, when the wheel stopped, guilt was revealed. This is the story of the judge who abolished evidence and replaced it with fate, a darkness whispered from the year 1347. In the deep heart of the 14th century, a time when the earth was flat for the common man and the heavens were a canvas for divine, terrifying signs, the small barony of Oswyth was a place forgotten by the grand tapestry of European power, yet acutely remembered by the cold hand of fear. The Black Death, a shadow yet to fully descend upon the continent, had already begun its insidious work in the minds of the people, manifesting not just as plague, but as a deeper, more profound suspicion. Every misfortune, every crop blight, every stillborn child demanded a human answer, a soul to bear the unbearable weight of God's displeasure. Into this vacuum of reason stepped Alaric of Oswyth, a man who, by accident of birth and cunning of mind, had inherited the mantle of High Judge. Alaric was not a brute. He was, in his own terrible way, a philosopher of despair. He had seen the failure of the established judicial process, the whispered bribes, the conflicting testimonies, the relentless, agonizing brutality of torture that often wrung a confession from the innocent just as readily as the guilty. He believed the human mind was too flawed, too easily corrupted by coin and cowardice to ever truly discern truth. He sought a justice that was clean, absolute, and utterly inhuman. He sought not proof, but revelation. And so, his gaze fell upon the most common, most unassuming object in any peasant's home, the spinning wheel. The transformation of this simple wooden mechanism was an act of deliberate, chilling ritual. Alaric commissioned an artisan, a man sworn to silence, and perhaps driven slightly mad by the task, to create his instrument of divine judgment. It was not the traditional wheel, but one of heavier, darker wood, its spokes meticulously balanced, its vertical axis mounted upon a sturdy, ornate pedestal. The most crucial addition was the gnomon of judgment, a precisely placed, sharpened iron stylus fixed to the frame, positioned to mark the circumference of the spinning wheel's main drive. This circumference, the outer rim of the great wooden circle, was then divided into 24 meticulously carved segments. Each segment, equidistant and identical, was inlaid with a sliver of polished obsidian or chalked with a single unadorned symbol. Half of the symbols were the Holy Cross, the mark of innocence, the shield of the justified. The other half were the Ouroboros, the serpent biting its own tail, a symbol Alaric declared represented the endless, cyclical nature of sin and deceit. 12 crosses, 12 serpents, a perfect balance of light and shadow, and upon this balance, all fate was to be cast. The ceremony of the Rota Veritatis became the sole judicial proceeding in Oswyth. When an accusation was brought, be it petty theft, the suspicion of witchcraft, or even murder, the accused was brought before the judge in the echoing, dust-choked chamber that served as the hall of law. The silence was the first torment. Alaric would stand, his robes of undyed heavy wool lending him the appearance of a mournful, tireless priest. He would never look the accused in the eye. He would look only at the wheel. The procedure itself was deceptively simple, yet steeped in theatrical tension. First, the accusation would be read aloud, a dry, factual recitation of the crime, the name of the accuser, and the alleged injury. The accused was permitted only 3 words of defense: "I am innocent." Nothing more was tolerated. Any attempt to introduce evidence, to call witnesses, or to engage in reasoned argument was met with a swift, cold dismissal. "The evidence of men," Alaric would intone, his voice a low, gravelly whisper, "is the dust of lies. Only the hand of God may sweep it clear." Then came the moment of the consecration. Alaric would take a vial of holy water, or what he claimed was holy water, and sprinkle a few drops upon the wooden segments of the wheel. murmuring an invocation in Latin, a prayer lifted from some forgotten apocryphal text that spoke of true sight and incorruptible arbitration. He was cleansing the instrument, purifying the mechanism of chance, making it a receptive conduit for the divine will. The suspense would be a physical weight in the room, pressing down on the chest of the accused. The climax arrived with the rotation. Alaric, and only Alaric, was permitted to set the wheel in motion. He would approach the rota with a reverent slowness, placing his hand upon the central shaft. He would then draw back and, with a sudden, measured, and decisive force, spin the great wheel. The wheel was engineered to turn with a smooth, relentless momentum, its silent rotation a dizzying blur of wood and cymbal. It was designed to spin for a long time, drawing out the final, agonizing moment. The sound in the chamber would be only the faint, dry hiss of the axle turning in its bearing, a sound like a snake slithering across stone. The accused, by custom and terrified instruction, had to keep his eyes fixed on the spinning blur. They were told that the wheel was not just a piece of wood, but a mirror for the soul. If their heart was pure, the Holy Cross would surely be chosen. If a dark secret festered within them, the serpent would rise to meet the gnomon. This psychological torment was often as damaging as any physical punishment. Men, broken by the sheer spectacle, had been known to confess to crimes they never committed simply to halt the unbearable rotation. Slowly, inevitably, the momentum would begin to wane. The blur would resolve into individual spokes, and the symbols would flash past the iron stylus in a rhythmic succession. Cross, serpent, cross, serpent. Faster and faster the eye would track them, searching for the pattern, the omen, the sign. The final seconds were an eternity. The wheel would rock, shudder, make one last desperate attempt at rotation before it settled, often with a faint, breath-like sigh. And then, the verdict. The iron stylus, the gnomon of judgment, rested perfectly aligned with one of the 24 segments. Alaric would lean forward, his face utterly devoid of expression, and peer down at the chosen symbol. If the wheel had chosen a cross, the verdict was non ros. The accused was declared innocent, often with a chilling caveat: "Go and sin no more, for your fate was in God's hands, but your soul remains in your own." They were free to leave, though often they carried the psychological scars of the trial and the indelible stigma of having been chosen for the wheel in the first place. But if the wheel had chosen the Ouroboros, the serpent, the verdict was reus est, guilty. Alaric would not speak an epitaph, or a lecture, or a sermon. He would simply state the word, cold and absolute, serpens. And the sentence, almost invariably the sentence, was execution by hanging. The speed of the process was perhaps the most frightening aspect. A man could be accused, tried, convicted, and hanged, all within the span of a single afternoon. There was no appeal, no clemency, no stay of execution. The will of God, as interpreted by the Rota Veritatis, was instant and final. The genius and the horror of Alaric's system lay in its incorruptibility by man. No amount of gold could sway the balance of the wheel. No eloquent lawyer could argue against the silence of a spinning artifact. Alaric had taken the greatest human flaw, the desire to interfere, to manipulate, to negotiate, and removed it entirely. He had replaced the messy human world of justice with the terrifyingly pure, unfeeling world of probability. The mathematical chance of being found guilty was exactly 1 in 2, a coin toss for a life, a true and brutal trial by ordeal for a society that still clung to the notion that the divine would always intervene to save the innocent. Yet, as the years passed, a creeping, silent dread began to settle upon Oswith. The people were not reassured by this clean justice. They were terrified. The wheel spun with an unsettling frequency. Every local conflict, every perceived slight, every desperate accusation made in haste led immediately to the Rota. An innocent man watching his life approach its end on the whim of a wooden circle became a common tragedy. Whispers began to travel across the barony, insidious and low. Whispers about Judge Alaric. Had he truly given over all authority to the divine mechanism? Or did the judge, the only man to touch the wheel, retain some human advantage? The rumors spoke of a minute, almost imperceptible imbalance. A heavy spoke here, a slightly warped axis there, that Alaric, with his practiced, deliberate push, had learned to exploit. Did he know, with the certainty of a master mechanic, how to nudge the probabilities? Did he, in his arrogance, believe he could control God's will? One account, preserved in the dusty archives of a nearby monastery, tells of a miller named Thomas, accused of hoarding grain during a small local famine. A man of quiet piety, Thomas stood firm in his innocence, refusing to plead guilty and accept a lesser punishment, placing his entire simple faith in the divine hand. When Alaric spun the wheel, the rotation was perfect, mesmerizingly smooth, but in its final, slow descent, it seemed to hesitate, trembling between the segment of the cross and the segment of the serpent. For a terrible, drawn-out minute, the stylus hovered, neither touching nor releasing. Then, Alaric did something unprecedented. He did not touch the wheel, but he spoke to it. "Let the will be known, O Rota. Your hesitation is the devil's last breath." And as his voice faded, the wheel gave a final tiny shudder, and the gnomon settled with a definitive thunk on the serpent. Thomas was hanged, and the famine did not ease. The truth, as always, was more complex and far less magical than the terrified villagers believed. Alaric, through years of obsessive practice, had become a master of initial velocity. He had learned the exact force, the precise angle of the push, required to make the wheel complete a certain number of rotations before friction brought it to rest. He could not dictate the exact segment, but he could ensure that the final decisive resting point would be drawn from a small controlled arc of 3 or 4 segments. And those segments, Alaric had quietly and secretly, over many years, marked with almost invisible variations, a slight coarseness on the wood, a minute chip in the inlaid obsidian. When he desired a verdict of guilt, he would apply a force that he knew would terminate the rotation in an arc that contained a higher proportion of serpents. When he desired a verdict of innocence, he would shift his grip, change his push, and land the result in an arc dominated by the crosses. He was not controlling God, he was mimicking chance. He was not a tool of the divine, but a master of engineered deception. He had not abolished human interference, he had merely centralized it, making himself the single, flawless point of corruption. And why? Not for money, for Alaric was already wealthy. Not for power, for he already held absolute, unquestioned judicial authority. He did it for certainty. He was a man deeply afraid of the gray areas of human existence, the moral ambiguities that haunt true justice. He chose the wheel because he could not bear the responsibility of choosing himself. He created a perfect scapegoat, an unthinking machine, and then he secretly gave himself the remote control. The wheel allowed him to execute a man, and then, with a clear conscience, declare, "It was not I, but the will of God." The Rota Veritatis was not an engine of truth. It was an engine of evasion. The reign of the wheel eventually came to an end, not through rebellion or enlightenment, but through the same force that began it, fear. A powerful traveling noble, a baron from a neighboring land, was arrested on Alaric's territory for what amounted to a boundary dispute, and was immediately subjected to the Rota. The wheel, perhaps in a true moment of unbridled chance, decreed serpents. Alaric, bound by his own ritual, had the noble executed. The fallout was swift and violent. The noble's kin, unconcerned with the purity of divine judgment, sent an army to Oswith. The Hall of Law was breached. Judge Alaric, still dressed in his heavy robes, made no move to flee. He was found standing beside the Rota Veritatis, his hand resting lightly on the great wooden circle. The soldiers, men of a different tradition of law, stared in fascinated horror at the object of legend. They did not understand its philosophical depth, only its terrible, final power. They did not execute Alaric immediately. Instead, as a final, bitter parody of his own justice, they forced him to stand before the wheel. One of the soldiers, a man who had lost his own brother to a judicial error, stepped forward. He did not spin the wheel with Alaric's precise, measured force. He spun it with a savage, furious abandon. The wheel howled on its axis, rotating faster and longer than it ever had before, a blur of motion that seemed to defy the laws of mechanics, shaking and rattling as if trying to tear itself from the pedestal. And when it finally, slowly, violently, came to a jarring halt, the gnomon of judgment rested on the symbol that had condemned hundreds of innocents, the Ouroboros, the serpent. Alaric of Oswith, the man who had perfected the art of the half-truth and the calculated spin, was hanged within the hour by the very rope he had ordered for his victim. The soldiers then took the Rota Veritatis, the terrible, beautiful instrument of false justice, and dragged it out into the town square. They did not burn it, for fire was too clean. They took axes and broke it into 1,000 splinters, scattering the wooden dust and the inlaid symbols to the wind, until no one could tell the difference between the fragment of a cross and the fragment of a serpent. The pieces of the judge's guilt were thus merged with the memory of his law. The dark story of the Rota Veritatis is not just a tale of a judge who used a tool of fate, but a profound reflection on the nature of human power. Alaric's grand, theatrical invention reveals the ultimate corruption, the moment a person seeks to replace responsibility with ritual. He didn't crave crave power over life and death. He craved blamelessness in the exercise of that power. He masked his own fallibility, his own fear of error, behind the glorious, unanswerable authority of God's chance. His sin was the sin of all tyrants who claim divine mandate. He took the highest moral duty of mankind, the slow, difficult, and humble search for truth, and reduced it to a cheap, spectacular trick. He proved in the end that even when a judge stands apart from all human evidence, casting his lot with the cold mathematics of chance, the shadow of human manipulation will always settle over the final outcome. The wheel stopped, and it did not reveal God's will, but the indelible, persistent greed of the human heart for the evasion of consequence. If the ancient shadows of medieval deception hold a strange, chilling fascination for you, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications, because next week we uncover the chilling reality behind the vow of silence taken by the Iron Monks of Transylvania.